Welcome back to the second part of the Affective Neuroscience lecture, which will focus on the reward system, and it will focus on emotional regulation, although I probably need to speed up the second part of the lecture on emotional regulation. Here you can see a number of rewards, and the question would be, well, what are rewards really? They're typically the things that we like, such as, sushi, which is something that many people like. This is one of my favorite beers from Cologne. Served there together with a sausage, which, well, I've become vegetarian, so I don't eat that anymore. And many people are highly motivated by money, I guess. You're studying business economics, so this might be something that motivates you as well. So if you define rewards, they are the outcomes of our desires and goals. They are the things that we plan for. For instance, when you think about a career, there are certain steps in the career that are rewarding. When you finish the first degree, that's quite rewarding. You do the second degree, that's also quite rewarding. And then eventually you get a job, and it just goes downhill from there, right? No, I'm kidding. Obviously, then you earn the appropriate amount of money for having prepared for this for such a long time. But one of the main things is that whatever we do, whatever we define to be a reward, should be something that improves our reproductive success and our evolutionary fitness. This is obviously true for primary rewards, which we, defined as food, drink, sexual intercourse is one of them. So these kinds of things that make sure that we can either ensure our current survival or the survival of our genes. There are a couple of exceptions. There are drugs of abuse, which we know hijack the reward system. So they basically lead to copious releases of dopamine in the reward system, which I'll show you in a second. And then there's a bunch of new things that are rewarding by association and by design in a way. Video games are designed to be rewarding and addictive and habit forming. Fortnite is a big one. I can see this in my son. He used to play Fortnite, but he switched now. But this was kind of his entry drug into the world of gaming. And, he hasn't left it yet. And in fact, the World Health Organization defined gaming disorder as a new disease. And there's similar things that may be occurring with social media, as well as internet in general. So we have internet disorder, or these types of addictive forms of habits that, they don't really help us in our daily lives. However, when it comes to video games, you can actually make quite a bit of money if you're good. Although at the age of 20, you then have carpal tunnel syndrome and might not be able to use half of your body anymore. So the question we're asking here is, what is the neural basis of reward processing? And there's quite a bit of evidence from the field of neuroeconomics that implicates the following system in reward processing. So we have the prefrontal cortex, but particularly the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. We have the nucleus accumbens, which we talked about in the last round. So this little green area here is the nucleus accumbens. And we have the origin of these dopaminergic projections. So this is basically the dopamine system here, which is the ventral tegmental area. These are dopaminergic neurons that communicate with striatum and the VMPFC, or the orbitofrontal cortex, which is right here. There's a recent not so recent anymore, but Batra et al. In Neuroimage in 2013, they conducted a meta-analysis based on over 200 studies in neuroeconomics that looked at subjective value. So how we evaluate different types of rewards: monetary rewards, social rewards, primary rewards like foods and drinks when we're thirsty. And they found that this system is implicated in this. So we have the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, we have the ventral striatum. So it's exactly these regions that are shown on the left here. This is the ventral striatum here in a coronal slice. This is the striatum in a sagittal slice. But you also see the anterior insula involved in both positive and negative valuations. So there's a large system involved, well, consisting of at least 3-4 regions. Striatum here, VMPFC here, insula here, and then possibly the posterior singular cortex as well, that whose activity correlates with how much something is worth to the subject at the time that they're making decisions. So this is kind of a neat finding, that this is consistent across so many studies. Now, if we focus on the VTA and the nucleus accumbens, then we can go back to one of the studies that shows the importance of these regions in decision making, particularly in a learning context. So we talked about Pavlovian conditioning earlier on the negative side of things, so on the withdrawal side of things. Now we're talking about the same aspect on the approach side of things, so when we work for something positive. And I'm sure that you've discussed this in Maël Le Breton's lecture. This is the neural correlate of the reward prediction error. Let me just briefly walk you through this because you know this already. So we have a monkey who's sitting in a chair here. He has an electrode implanted. So this is a single unit recording study with an electrode that goes right into his VTA, his ventral tegmental area. Just to remind you, it's this region here, it's this region here. So they're recording directly from this region. And as the monkey learns about the environment, he first, when he doesn't know much, shows an increased dopaminergic response when the reward comes on. And that's what's shown in this line here. This is the average firing rate of all of the different neurons that are recorded from in this study. Each row here is a neuron. Each dot is when an action potential is fired. So these are different neurons going down here. So you can average these responses and you get this increased response followed by a sort of dip afterwards when the monkey is experiencing an unexpected reward. An unexpected reward in terms of prediction error means there was no prediction, so it's a positive prediction error, right? Since we couldn't make a prediction about this, the environment all of a sudden becomes better than expected. As soon as the monkey learns, however, that a conditioned stimulus like a tone or a light, in this case it's a sign on the screen for the monkey, he learns that this is predictive of reward, and then he will show this increased activity to the conditioned stimulus. So he's saying, something good is about to happen, and then he will show no reward prediction error at the time that the reward is delivered. That's what's shown by the R here, right? The R means the monkey just got the reward. No difference here because, everything is as predicted. We expected the reward and we got the reward and we got exactly the same magnitude. Now, in case that the environment is worse than what was expected, so here this sets the expectation again. Dopamine neurons are paying attention. They see that the conditioned stimulus came on. They fire more rapidly during this period, immediately after the conditioned stimulus, and they're awaiting the reward about a second and a half later. But then, no reward is coming here. So no R means the reward was omitted. And you see this big dip in dopaminergic activity. So that's sort of a negative prediction error signal. So one of the things, obviously, that the system therefore encodes is how much better or worse is the environment than what we expected. And this happens in the ventral tegmental area. And it's an important finding for neuroeconomics that we'll also discuss at a later point and that you have discussed already. Now, a number of researchers wanted to see the neural correlates of reward anticipation in humans. So they used fMRI to do this. And the MID, the Monetary Incentive Delay Task, was invented by Brian Knudsen and colleagues in 2000. So that's now 20 years back. And back then it made quite an impact. It's been replicated multiple times across, I think, 50 plus studies at this point. It's a very simple task, in fact. So there is a cue that's shown to the participant at the beginning of a trial that lasts about, about 6 seconds, right? Then there's a bit of a delay. The subject sees a target and simply has to press a button as fast as possible when the target came on. And then on half the trials, they get €5 and they are shown the account total here. So they get feedback after they responded about how well they did. and the cue tells them how much money they can win for pressing fast to this target. So they have to stay engaged in the task to make money, basically. It's 3 bars here means they can win 5 euros, 2 bars means they can win 1 euro, and 1 bar means they can win 0 euros. Dollars in this case. So this was done in the US. But it's, as I said, it's been replicated here in Europe as well. And what we find is that during this period of reward anticipation, right here, during this delay period, when they're about to respond, the nucleus accumbens shows increased activity. And this activity scales with the amount of money that they're being offered. So that means if they're offered more money, there's greater nucleus accumbens activity as a form of reward anticipation. That scales with how much money they could earn on a given trial. Excuse me. Now, this is the nucleus accumbens basically encoding how good the environment is, how much better the environment can be in terms of anticipation. That's not all that this region does. So in the light of complicating things just a little bit, we conducted a study 10 years after this in which we did these mixed gambles, but this was done entirely in the domain of shocks. So there was no positive outcome at all. It's only negative outcomes. But the ventral striatum still encodes if something is better than expected, so less shocks in this case, that is then seen as a reward, or worse than expected, so that's more shocks, which shows a deactivation in the ventral striatum. So the striatum basically also encodes how good or bad something is actually, or going to be in terms of expectation, if there's no positive outcome but only, well, better or worse outcome. So it's a relative coding basically that the ventral striatum performs here. And it's not just about getting rewards, it's also about avoiding punishment, which is in itself a reward. So it's a context-dependent effect. Now when we looked at this system here now, the ventral tegmental area and the ventral striatum as part of the reward system, but what happens when we look at, well, what some people call the orbitofrontal cortex, which is basically this big chunk of tissue right here at the front of the brain. But in neuroeconomics, they prefer the term ventromedial prefrontal cortex because it goes across anatomical boundaries. So don't get confused by different terminologies. This is one of the problems when we move from animal studies, which talk clearly about orbitofrontal cortex, to human studies, which talk clearly about ventromedial prefrontal cortex. And what has been found there is that both primary and secondary rewards are processed clearly in this orbitofrontal region, ventromedial prefrontal region. So when we talk about simple rewards, then what we see is if we have hungry subjects in the scanner, we can see that when they're responding for food or when they're performing a task for food and then also receiving different types of foods in the scanner, it's usually liquidized and then pumped into their mouth, but it tastes good still. Then you can see that the response of the OFC is also a linear increase in terms of how pleasant participants think the food that they're receiving was. And typically you're doing this with either hungry or thirsty participants, depending on what kind of stimulus you use, so that they're actually motivated to experience the stimulus, the food in the scanner. Similarly, the OFC, and here this is clearly VMPFC, also responds to how attractive faces are. So you can show a number of faces to the participant in the scanner, and these are some examples here. And then later on ask them to rate each face and then correlate the rating of each face while the subject is looking at this face. And you see that there's a linear increase in how attractive the face is in this orbitofrontal cortex region. So faces are also something that is inherently rewarding to us or inherently aesthetic. Similar findings have been found for the aesthetic value of art, shown here also in the OFC, but well, this is not a very convincing finding, to be honest. It's an older study. Now I would probably not pay too much attention to this kind of, but this has been replicated in more recent studies. And finally, money. So there's, as Brian Knudsen has shown in the nucleus accumbens, there's similar scaling. So linear increases with how much money people are getting, or deciding over, or anticipating across different tasks. Different aspects of this are assessed in the scanner. The important thing is there's this linear increase, right? So you have something that goes up and scales with how much of something the participant is getting, and the brain is reflecting this increase. Again, in the light of complicating things quite a bit, I'd like to point out again that the OFC does not encode only reward. The brain is significantly more complex than is often portrayed in the press. So this wonderful meta-analysis by Lindqvist and colleagues shows that quite clearly. You can see that across the studies that looked at the lateral orbitofrontal cortex here, you see that it's involved in disgust quite a bit, in fear also, in the experience of fear, experience of sadness, perception of sadness, not so much in happiness, but across these negative emotions. And there's quite a strong distinction between anger and disgust. Anger is an approach emotion, considered by some to be an approach emotion, where when you're angry, you want to approach that stimulus or the person that made you angry, whereas disgust is a clear withdrawal emotion, and it seems to process both to some degree. So again, while there is some consistency of the OFC involved in emotions like disgust and also somewhat fear and sadness, it's not really specific. So it processes all emotions. So it doesn't agree with basic emotion theory. And therefore, we'll briefly discuss another theory, which I quite like, namely psychological constructivism. So this evidence brings us to psychological constructivism, or the theory of constructed emotion by Lisa Feldman-Barrett. And it basically states that, well, emotions don't exist in the form that we may be talking about them, namely as discrete and separate emotions as proposed by basic emotion theory. So we don't have, while we experience happiness, sadness, fear, anger, disgust in us, in ourselves and others, these are categories that are formed on basic processes that are represented in the brain. So the brain has affective processes that, as we have seen, interact with cognitive processes. And one such cognitive process might be the categorization of what's going on currently in our brain, and then labeling this, putting semantics to it. And this basically agrees well with evidence of, well, first of all, the Lindqvist meta-analysis, which showed that there is no specificity to any emotions within the brain. So that's the study we talked about quite a bit. That's one piece of evidence. And the other piece of evidence is sort of an understanding that the brain doesn't work in, well, individual blobs of activation. So there's not a single brain area that does just one thing and does this all the time. So we have a specificity problem. Let's say one of the most consistent regions in the brain is the fusiform gyrus, the FFG, also called the fusiform face area. But even this region doesn't just encode faces. It also encodes other aspects of, well, let's say the body or the environment in general. So it has consistently been shown to be involved in face encoding, but doesn't only do this aspect. And so what we have started the way we have started to think about the brain is that, yes, there are regions that prefer to encode one type of information, but depending on the inputs and the outputs, so the network that it currently communicates with, these types of information might reveal different things and might contribute different types of information. So what Lindqvist et al. Is concluding in her in their meta-analysis, is that emotions are psychological events that emerge out of more basic psychological operations, which are represented throughout the brain. And they're not specific to emotion. They can be cognitive processes and they can be affective processes, but only together do they lead to the types of experiences that we have, such as, saying that now we're happy, now we're sad. One way to think about this, and this is not directly taken from psychological constructivism, is that we may have a representation of arousal, something that the insula tends to do. So do we currently have low arousal? Is our heart rate low? Is our heart rate high, etc.? And we may have representations of valence within the brain. So let's say something is relatively positive versus something is relatively negative. And then combining these two pieces of information within the brain can lead to different types of information or different types of conclusions about our current affective state. Now, obviously, additional information can go into this computation, something more interoceptive than just arousal. So, contextual information, what just happened, because context changes how we interpret situations, and also our affective states. They also affect the kinds of actions that we can do next. So it's a much more dynamic process than just what basic emotion theory suggests, which is, you have one area in the brain that is only doing anger or fear, and when that activates, you feel angry or fearful. And it's simply not like that. So Feldman-Barrett, in her book How Emotions Are Made, says, in every waking moment, your brain uses past experience, so that's sort of like a context information, organized as concepts to guide your actions and give your sensations meaning. When these concepts involved our emotion concepts, your brain constructs instances of emotion. So this is something that I wanted to introduce to you. So we have now somewhat of a struggle between basic emotion theory and psychological constructivism, but obviously this is not entirely resolved. It's still an ongoing debate in both neuroscience and cognitive science and affective science. So what are the take-home messages? The brain produces emotions and related behavior via circuits on networks that are highly dynamic and interactive. Right? That's the interactive nature of this process. It's not just one region that always does the same thing. Relatedly, there's no emotion without cognition, as these seemingly separate functions depend on each other. And this might give us some information about what consciousness might be. Because only when specific aspects of the brain might co-activate do we have consciousness. Well, my current favorite at the moment is the constructionist theory of emotion. And again, there may be multiple ones. There are many other ones that we haven't discussed yet, but they're not as neuroscientifically informed, so I focused on these. Okay, so this concludes the topic of what we started with. So basically trying to divide the brain into approach and withdrawal type processes. And we just discussed the approach process, right? And the approach system, including the ventral striatum and ventral medial prefrontal cortex that are processing rewards and things that motivate us to do stuff for it.